Only by returning to the roots of political philosophy, to classical natural right, can we find a path through the ruins of relativism, historicism, and nihilism. We are brought face to face with the question, if there is no natural right, is there any ground left for moral judgment, for resistance, for the distinction between good and evil?
Welcome to Bookscape Epic Reads, where we dive deep into the world of popular books, exploring timeless classics and modern bestsellers alike. Join us for in-depth reviews, insightful discussions, reflections. Let roll.
We are brought face to face with the question, if there is no natural right, is there any ground left for moral judgment, for resistance, for the distinction between good and evil? In this final part of Natural Right and History, Leo Strauss does not simply summarize his argument, he raises the stakes. He shows that the abandonment of natural right is not merely an academic error, a philosophical detour, or an unfortunate preference. It is a civilizational turning point, a descent into a darkness where the human spirit risks losing its orientation altogether. It is, in the starkest terms, the age of nihilism. Nihilism, in Strauss's diagnosis, is not simply a mood of despair. It is the logical conclusion of modernity's rebellion against natural right. When we declare that there are no eternal truths, when we reduce values to preferences, when we historicize justice and moral order, we are not neutralizing danger. We are erasing the foundations on which we stand. And what replaces them? Power, will technique. In place of reasoned moral judgment, we get ideology and force. In place of truth, we get persuasion and manipulation. The triumph of relativism does not lead to tolerance, Strauss warns. It leads to the rule of the strong over the weak, the loud over the wise, the immediate over the enduring. The collapse of reason's authority. At the heart of Strauss's concern is the eclipse of reason, not reason as scientific calculation, but reason as the search for moral and political truth. Once, reason had a noble task, to discover what is good by nature, to understand justice, to seek the best life for man. But with modernity came a reduction of reason to instrumental rationality, to a tool for achieving ends, regardless of their worth. Strauss traces this crisis to the core of Enlightenment thought. The rationalism of the 17th and 18th centuries sought to ground morality in reason alone, independent of nature or tradition. But in doing so, it ultimately undermined reason's own authority. The Kantian and utilitarian projects, however noble, failed to supply binding moral obligations. And so, over time, the question was no longer what is right, but who decides. Ethics became politics, and politics became a struggle for power. In this atmosphere, even the greatest atrocities could be justified by ideological necessity or cultural particularity. Once moral truth becomes relative, everything becomes permissible. Not in theory perhaps, but in practice. The result is not freedom, but spiritual exhaustion. Nihilism as the shadow of modernity. Strauss borrows from Nietzsche's insight that nihilism is the shadow cast by the death of God, or rather, the death of absolute value. Nietzsche diagnosed the problem acutely. Modernity had undermined the foundations of its own morality, yet continued to act as if those values still held meaning. But Strauss takes it one step further. He shows how political nihilism follows directly from the rejection of natural right. In the wake of 2 world wars, the rise of totalitarianism and the disintegration of liberal certainties, Strauss saw that the West was no longer guided by a shared understanding of the just or the good. Instead, it lived off the residue of forgotten truths, pretending to be value-neutral while drifting toward spiritual homelessness. Modern democratic societies claim to defend human dignity and freedom, but on what basis? Without natural right, there is no grounding for universal rights, only historical conventions. Without reason, there is no way to judge between tyranny and justice, only preferences, cultures, ideologies. The crisis deepens because we no longer believe we are justified in resisting injustice, except by appeal to consensus or power. Strauss's return to the ancients. But Strauss does not leave us in despair. In the midst of this spiritual crisis, He turns back, radically and deliberately, to the classical tradition. The only way to escape nihilism, he argues, is to recover the possibility of natural right, not as a nostalgic return to a pre-modern order, but as a renewed commitment to philosophy as the search for truth. This return means recovering the Socratic question: what is the good life? It means taking seriously the idea that human nature is not infinitely malleable, and that justice is not merely a construct, but something we can know, however imperfectly, through reason. It means restoring the dignity of the philosophical life, the life guided not by ideology, but by the love of wisdom. Strauss sees the classical tradition not as a set of doctrines, but as a way of life, a way of confronting the eternal questions without arrogance or despair. This is why the ancients matter, not because they had all the answers, but because they never stopped asking the right questions. The task ahead, the crisis of modernity, Strauss tells us, is not irreversible, but it is profound. We cannot escape nihilism by slogans, by political activism, or by appeals to sentiment. We can only overcome it by relearning how to think, by reviving the serious pursuit of the truth about human things. This is a challenge that requires courage, patience, and humility. It requires a new generation of thinkers willing to resist both dogmatism and despair, and to ask again, what is justice? What is the best regime? What is man's purpose by nature? Only then can the eclipse of reason be reversed. Only then can we once again speak of right and wrong, of noble and base, not as arbitrary constructs, but as part of a moral order intelligible to human reason. The alternative, Strauss warns us, is not freedom, but the abyss. Only by returning to the roots of political philosophy, to classical natural right, can we find a path through the ruins of relativism, historicism, and nihilism. In the final chapter of Natural Right and History, Leo Strauss offers not just a critique of modernity, but a proposal for recovery. After diagnosing the deep moral and philosophical crisis of our age, the collapse of belief in absolute standards, the loss of confidence in reason, and the rise of nihilism, Strauss calls for a return. Not a return to the past for its own sake, not a nostalgic retreat into tradition, but a reawakening of the classical political philosophy that once gave meaning and direction to human life. This is the recovery of classical natural right, and it is for Strauss both the most urgent and most hopeful task before us. Why the ancients? Why return to the classical conception of natural right, to the thought of Plato, Aristotle, and the Greek tradition? Strauss's answer is deceptively simple, because they took the question of justice more seriously than any who came after. For the ancients, the central concern of political philosophy was not power, interest, or historical development. It was, what is the best life for human beings? What is the just society? These were not rhetorical questions. They were the core of the philosophical life, and they were approached not by appeal to myth or custom, nor by mere rational calculation, but through serious inquiry grounded in human nature. Unlike the moderns, the ancients did not seek to remake the world according to abstract reason. They understood that human beings are limited creatures, that politics is a realm of prudence, and that moral knowledge must always be balanced with an awareness of our finitude. Yet they also believed that there is such a thing as truth, that there are natural distinctions between right and wrong, noble and base, just and unjust, distinctions that reason can grasp. Strauss urges us to recover this ancient confidence, not to blindly follow Aristotle or Plato, but to relearn how to ask their questions and to once again recognize the authority of reason in moral and political life, beyond modern dogma and skepticism. Strauss is careful to distinguish classical natural right from both modern dogmatism and modern skepticism. Unlike the Enlightenment's rationalism, classical natural right does not rest on rigid axioms or abstract systems. It is not utopian. It is attentive to diversity, sensitive to context, and aware that the best regime may not always be attainable. It understands the gap between the ideal and the real. And unlike the historicist or relativist, the classical thinker does not assume that all values are historically conditioned or culturally constructed. He believes that human beings share a common nature, and that this nature sets the standard by which societies can be judged. To be human is not to be infinitely malleable. It is to be a creature with ends, with potentials, and with a moral horizon. Therefore, Strauss's recovery of natural right is not a call for universal blueprints or ideological certainty. It is a call for the return of philosophy, a return to the careful, open and searching inquiry into the good life and the just society, guided by reason and rooted in nature. Natural right and the hierarchy of ends. One of the central themes of classical natural right is the idea of a hierarchy of ends. Not all ways of life are equal. Not all desires are worthy. The life of virtue is higher than the life of pleasure. The life of philosophy is higher still. This recognition is what gives classical political thought its depth and structure. A society that acknowledges natural right aims to promote human flourishing, not just material comfort or freedom of choice, but the cultivation of virtue, the pursuit of wisdom, and the honoring of excellence. It does not assume that freedom is the highest good, but asks, freedom for what? Equality of what? Strauss argues that modern liberalism, in abandoning the question of ends, reduces justice to procedure neutrality or subjective preference. Classical natural right, by contrast, insists that the good life has a shape, and that political life should be ordered toward making that life possible. Nature as a standard. To recover natural right means to take nature seriously, not in a biological or mechanistic sense, but as the source of intelligible moral order. For the ancients, nature is not value neutral. It is not the chaotic background upon which we impose meaning. It is the framework within which human excellence becomes possible. By observing nature, especially human nature, we can come to know something about justice, about the limits of human action, and about the conditions necessary for human flourishing. This is not a science in the modern sense. It is a practical wisdom born of experience, reflection, and open dialogue. Strauss reminds us that this understanding of nature is what made political philosophy possible in the first place. Without nature as a standard, we are left only with history, culture, and will, and ultimately, with the void of nihilism. The philosophical life reaffirmed. Finally, the recovery of classical natural right is also the recovery of the philosophical life. For Strauss, the ultimate implication of classical thought is that the best life is the life of contemplation, the life devoted to seeking truth, understanding the good, and asking the questions that will never fully be answered. This does not mean that philosophy rules politics. It means that philosophy gives orientation to politics. It reminds us of the higher things, of the permanent questions, and of the limits of all human endeavors. In a world driven by ideology, distraction, and speed, the philosophical life becomes an act of resistance and of hope. Strauss ends his work not with prescriptions, but with a challenge: to recover political philosophy as a living pursuit, to go back in order to go forward, to reclaim the seriousness of the question, how should we live? Not because we can answer it easily, but because not asking it is the beginning of decay.